Suppose one day you were going to walk around your neighborhood and you stumbled upon a curious ring. You pick up the ring, you're intrigued by it. Playing around, you put the ring on your finger and fiddle with it, and it turns out the ring turns you invisible. What would you do with this power? Would you use it for good? Would you use it for evil? What does your answer to that question tell you about things like human nature? What does it tell you about questions of justice? This is a story that I'm going to talk about in this video. I need to add some like dramatic music to make the story more compelling. Need to figure out how to do that. Anyway, this is a story that is at the start and at the heart of a book by the philosopher Plato. This is a story that features in Book 2 of Plato's Republic and is known as the Ring of Gyges. Now, we've already had some conversations about the relationship between myth and philosophy. Some philosophers of the Western tradition, such as Bertrand Russell, have put philosophy at odds with traditions such as religion or mythology. But within the Greek tradition, within the context of the writing of Plato, Plato draws upon mythological stories. Now, the Ring of Gyges might be better suited as a legend or maybe even a fable. The purpose of the point here, though, is that Plato likes to use allegory, myth, fable in order to illustrate deeper philosophical truths. And so one of the stories that we're going to explore today as a part of this series of stories that Plato uses within his Republic is called the Ring of Gyges. This is best understood within context of Plato's Republic as a whole, and we can also illuminate the story if we put it within the context of the allegory of the cave and some other myths that Plato uses in writings such as the Phaedrus, which we'll talk about here later. Plato's Republic is one of those foundational pieces of Western philosophy, one of the most influential books ever written. And Plato's Republic wrestles with some very large questions, probably the most significant of which is related to this question of justice. Specifically, what is justice? And the related question for Plato is the just person happier than the unjust person? Or what is the relationship between justice and happiness? As we'll see within the dialogues, Socrates is going to make a concerted effort to demonstrate the fact that justice is something which is both sought in and of itself and for what it produces, that Plato's theory of the forms hinges upon an understanding of reality that human beings seek out what's good and perform what's right because it's good in and of itself. And that ethics or virtue is not a means to an end, but is the end, is what we should be seeking after. Now, the Republic, like other of Plato's dialogues, includes a series of conversation between Socrates and some other interlocutors. Here we have four main interlocutors, but we're going to be focusing mostly on Glaucon pictured here. But you have Socrates. If you want to reference my video on Greek philosophy, Plato's Republic is often placed within Plato's middle dialogues. And what we start to see here is Plato, the writer, using Socrates as the mouthpiece for some of his ideas. As I explained in that other video, this gets a little complicated and sometimes difficult to interpret because the people that feature in Plato's dialogues were real people. But Plato is not really concerned with what we would call like historical accuracy. He's using these people to represent ideas. And Socrates is going to be representing Plato's idea of justice, but more importantly, the kind of philosophical underpinnings of justice that this idea is based off of, which is Plato's theory of the forms. So Socrates is going to be, the dialogue starts off with Socrates in conversation. We have three gentlemen here. Well, four, I'm sorry. We have four gentlemen here. Polymarchus brings Socrates to his father's house. So the dialogue starts out with a conversation between Socrates and Cephalus. Cephalus is Polymarchus's father. He's an older gentleman. And at first, the conversation starts off regarding the topic of old age and the benefits of old age. And Cephalus is saying that one of the benefits of old age is that you're not subject to the passions and the desires of love, both romantic love and seeking after love, trying to find relationships. That one of the benefits of being old is that you no longer have to the Greeks kind of conceived of love as like this passion that you had very little control over, this like all-consuming emotion that just like took a hold of your life and basically wrecked it. And Cephalus is saying, like, as you get older, you less and less have to deal with that because you're not as subject to your passions. And it's through this conversation about old age that Cephalus kind of makes this almost like offhanded remark about that one of the benefits that he experiences from being old is due in large part to his wealth, his not having to worry about finances or like where his next meal's coming from. And he has this line where he says that, and this is a direct quote, "A good person wouldn't easily bear old age if he were poor. Wealth can do a lot to save us from having to cheat or deceive someone against our will." The idea here being that Cephalus is lucky because of his wealth, because if he were poor, old age would be much more difficult, because even though he is a good person, he would have to kind of like lie, cheat, and steal because he's not able to like physically work in the same ways that he was able to. And this kind of remark by Cephalus is what starts this this larger conversation about justice. Thrasymachus says, kind of picking up this conversation, that I say that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. So Thrasymachus and Socrates kind of get into this back and forth, and Thrasymachus suggests that what is just is determined and dictated by those in power, basically, those in charge, politically speaking. So we move into this conversation of old age, into this larger political discourse about the nature and structure of justice. And Thrasymachus is making the argument that justice is basically dictated by those in power, or that justice is determined by the powerful. Socrates, of course, doesn't like this response, because you can see how kind of ethereal or willy-nilly that response can get, because what happens when we change power? We shift from one government to the next. And Thrasymachus even talks about the different styles of government, that justice might mean one thing under a democratic form of government, and justice might mean another thing under a tyrant. Socrates doesn't like that because it's completely dependent upon the whims of the leaders. For Socrates, justice has to be something that's firm and steady and unchanging, and wouldn't switch from government to government. And so the rest of the conversation of book one is kind of this back and forth between Socrates and Thrasymachus, which eventually is kind of resolved with Socrates making the point that, well, justice needs to be something that regardless of the type of government that is agreed upon, it has to be something foundational, that it can't just depend on the whims of who's in charge. And book two opens up with Glaucon kind of taking up this argument, because Glaucon believes that Thrasymachus was onto something and kind of wants to further push the point. So Glaucon opens up the conversation by categorizing the different types of goods. goods here not meaning like mercantile goods or trade goods, but what makes something good. And he outlines three different types of goods and of what is good, and asked Socrates, is going to ask Socrates, where does justice kind of fall into this? Because he has a larger point that he's trying to prove here. Glaucon says that first we have things that we welcome for their own sake, goods that we seek after in and of themselves. So the example that Glaucon himself gives is like joy or happiness. We want to be happy not because we perceive happiness to be some means to an end, but happiness is oftentimes the end that we're seeking after, right? We want to feel joyful. We want to feel like raptured in the moment, and that this is what we seek after in and of itself. The second type of good, he says, are goods which we seek for the rewards, the other things that come from it. An example of what he means by this might be something like physical health, or physical health via exercise, right? No one really well, I can't say nobody because I'm sure there's somebody out there that does, but no one likes to run, right? Running sucks. You're tired, you're miserable, you're breathing heavy, you feel like you're about to die, and you just can't wait for it to be over with. But why do you exercise? You exercise for the benefits that it produces, for this idea of health, for being in good shape, and for the positive benefits that health brings. You don't pursue exercise in and of itself because it's somehow pleasurable or enjoyable. Exercise in itself often sucks. So the second category is good for the sake of the rewards that it brings. And the third category, Glaucon says, we like for its own sake. So we like it in and of itself, such as joy, and for what comes from it, such as exercise. So it would be a combination of the first and the second category. And it's in this third category that Socrates is going to argue that justice falls. Justice is something that we value in and of itself, in that justice is supposed to bring benefit to the person who has achieved it or who is carrying it out. In other words, we would be just even if there was no reward, that it's something that we want to do regardless of the good that it brings. And we seek justice for the greater good that it causes, maybe not for our own personal gain, but we seek out justice for the good of the whole, for the good of the community, so to speak, because justice involves this kind of communal nature. This gets back to this idea that Plato will pick up on. So Socrates is overly concerned with questions of morality, questions of ethics, of doing what's good. But for the Greeks, ethics is intimately tied in with larger conversations about politics. So ethics is the individual question, what makes an individual's action good or bad. And that the Greeks believed that this was intimately related to the larger question of politics, what is good or bad for the whole of the group, for the community, for the state, for the city, or the city-state. And Socrates' argument is that justice falls into the third category, that it's something that we seek for itself, and it's something that we seek because of what comes from it. Now, Glaucon is playing kind of the devil's advocate role here. And in order to argue against Socrates, Glaucon's going to utilize the example of the ring of Gyges to show that we don't seek justice for the sake of justice, that we only seek it for the good that it brings us. So it's kind of a twist on what Socrates is saying here, kind of a turn of phrase there. So Glaucon's going to make the argument that the only reason why people are just is because they fear the consequences. So justice for Glaucon falls into is not necessarily a good in this regard, because it falls into a completely different sort of classification, that we behave in certain ways essentially out of fear, not because we want to do something good for ourselves or not because we want to do something good for other people, but we fear what people will do to us if we don't behave in a certain way. So justice for Glaucon carries very negative conversations. It's something that's forced on the individual from without by use of punishment. And in order to illustrate this, Glaucon's going to give the example of Gyges. So I want to read this at length. It's only a couple of paragraphs because it's worth quoting. This is what Glaucon says. According to the tradition, Gyges was a shepherd in the service of the king of Lydia. Now, I should note, and this is a historical point here, the story of Gyges is not something that's unique to Plato per se. We find Gyges, who is in the service of the king of Lydia, in a story that the Greek historian Herodotus tells, although there are some significant differences between the version that Herodotus presents and the version that Plato presents. And the version that Herodotus presents, there's no magic ring. Herodotus's version, Gyges is brought into the service of the king, and Gyges and the king are having this conversation, and the king basically is trying to convince Gyges about how beautiful his wife, the queen, is. And I don't know why this sort of conversation would come up, but the king says, well, you have to see my wife naked, but I can't just let you walk in and see my wife naked. You have to hide. So Gyges hides, sees the queen naked. The queen somehow finds out. The queen's upset that Gyges has seen her naked, and the queen convinces Gyges to kill the king and to marry her because he's seen her. It's a convoluted mess. But the importance of this is that this was a story that readers of Plato would have been familiar with. The name Gyges was something that they would know either through Herodotus or having read the story here. And this is one of those stories. For Herodotus, history is meant to teach like moral lessons. So this is a moral lesson that the reader would invoke certain thoughts and feelings within the reader, and Plato's kind of drawn upon that tradition here. Okay, according to the tradition, Gyges was a shepherd in the service of the king of Lydia. There was a great storm, and an earthquake made an opening in the earth at the place that he was feeding his flock. Amazed at the sight, he descended into the opening, where among other marvels he beheld a hollow brazen horse, having doors, at which he stooping and looking saw a dead body of stature. He saw a tall dead giant, right? As appeared to him more than human. And having nothing on but a gold ring, he took from the finger of the dead and rescinded. So it goes down. This will be important for later. Goes down into the cavern created by the earthquake, sees this horse. Inside the horse, he sees this dead giant who's wearing a ring, takes the ring, and goes back up. Now the shepherds met together according to the custom, that they might send their monthly report about the flocks to the king. Into their assembly he came, having the ring on his finger, and as he was sitting among them, he chanced to turn the ring inside his hand, when instantly he became invisible, and they spoke of him as if he were no longer present. He was astonished at this, and again touching the ring, he turned the collet outwards and reappeared. He made several trials of the ring, and always the same result. When he turned the collet inwards, he became invisible, when outward. Whereupon he contrived to be chosen one of the messengers who were sent to the court, where as soon as he arrived, he seduced the queen, and with her help conspired against the king, and slew him, and took the kingdom. That took a sharp turn there towards the end. So Gyges finds this ring that makes him invisible. What does he do with it? He goes to the king's court, he seduces the queen, he kills the king, and takes charge of the kingdom. This next part, this is Glaucon's interpretation. Suppose now there were two such magic rings, and the just put one of them, and the unjust the other. No man can be imagined to be of such iron nature that he would stand fast in justice. No man would keep his hands off of what was not his own when he could safely take what he liked out of the market or go into the houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would, and in all respects be like a god among men. So Glaucon believes that this story proves a larger point. And the larger point that Glaucon is trying to make here concerns both human nature and the nature of power. So, with respect to human nature, we kind of have two differing views here between Glaucon and Socrates. Glaucon believes that given the opportunity, if people are free from consequences of their action, people are going to do what is immediately either pleasurable for them or is going to do what immediately benefits them, and that what doesn't matter is whether the action is good or bad per se, that the person is not pursuing the goodness or the badness of the action. The person is pursuing the outcome of the action, what's going to benefit them the most. The Glaucon's reflection on human nature is that essentially people don't care about what's right or what's wrong, that people inherently care more about what is profitable to them, and that if given the opportunity, they're going to take that chance to seize power. Speaking of power, there's commentary on the nature of power itself here, which is the idea that, and you see this reflected in a lot of the superhero movies, shows, and literature as well. And of course, this story should sound somewhat familiar because it's not just reflected in the superhero genre, it's also reflected in the fantasy genre. This story should sound familiar because it's very similar to Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. If you remember the Ring of Power from the Lord of the Rings, it has the power to turn the whoever puts it on invisible. The overarching philosophical message is similar in that the ring corrupts whoever wields it. So even a seemingly innocent, benign character like Frodo, you see the scene in the Lord of the Rings where Frodo tries to like attack or kill. It's been a second since I've seen Lord of the Rings, so please forgive me if I get some of the details wrong. But even Frodo lashes out at Sam, his own best friend. And there are several characters within the series who refuse the ring or don't want to take the ring because they fear what the ring will do to him. And this is the idea that you've heard the phrase like power corrupts, or absolute power corrupts absolutely. Glaucon seems to be re-emphasizing that point of view with the ring of Gyges, that no matter what type of person we're talking about, whether it's the just person or the unjust person, that the consequence of somebody obtaining that level of power is going to ultimately be the same, that it's going to corrupt them. The kicker to this is that we're not just talking about magical artifacts, but remember, this is a conversation about the nature of politics, of justice. So what Glaucon's saying, a point that Socrates will fundamentally try to disagree with, is that it's within the nature of power itself to corrupt people. So even within the practical context of government, Socrates will want to argue. Plato famously argues for the idea of the philosopher king, for the king who, when put in that situation, would make the greatest level of decisions for the greatest amount of people because of his philosophical training and his ability to navigate these difficult situations. Glaucon's arguing that that's not how power works, and that even the best person, even the most holy or righteous person, take the most upright saint in history, put them in a position of political power, and it's going to turn sour. That power is going to inherently corrupt that person, and that anybody free of consequence will act unjustly. So there's this idea about human nature, and for Glaucon, he's going to take a very negative view of human nature. This conversation will be picked up, especially within the context of politics, later on in the history of Western philosophy, in a debate that takes place between Thomas Hobbes and the English philosopher John Locke, who will argue about human nature within the state of nature, but You can reference the Hobbes and Locke video if you're interested in that. And speaking of which, Glaucon's also putting forward this view of contractualism and egotism. Contractualism, and this is picking up on the argument that Thrasymachus makes in the first book of the Republic. Contractualism is this idea that justice is dictated by those in power, as Thrasymachus says. Later on, this kind of morphs into the idea of social contract theory. People agree upon certain moral standards or certain societal standards in order to get along with and to live in harmony with other people. And this undermines the idea, going back to Glaucon's distinction of the three types of goods, this undermines the idea that justice is something that ought to be sought in and of itself, or that is sought in and of itself. Contractualism is the understanding that justice is dictated by societal norms, and that the only reason why we agree to these norms, the only reason why we sacrifice, and Hobbes will make the same argument, the only reason why we sacrifice certain amounts of freedom is for the benefits of society as a whole. And egotism is basically a view of human nature which states that people are going to act primarily out of their own self-interest. And at the end of the day, that's what that boils down to. Now, this is going to be a fundamental problem for Socrates and Plato as a whole, because it seemingly undermines the very idea of ethics, in that it undermines the sense of altruism and the ability of people to act for the benefit of not themselves, of others. Morality is predicated on the idea that we can act not out of our own self-interest, but for the interest of the group as a whole. And what Glaucon's saying is that is not possible, that we always inherently act out of our own self-interest, and that human beings at their very core are innately, inherently selfish. And if that's true, Plato's understanding of morality and the understanding of ethics just doesn't get a start. You can't really say that people are acting ethical according to Plato. You might disagree here. You can't really say that people are making an ethical choice if they're acting out of their own self-interest. So another question, kind of related to what I was just saying, is that this story raises the more fundamental question of why should we be good? And this is a question that relates to other areas and aspects of ethics, as well as certain religious traditions. Why do you do good things? Do you do the good thing? And this is the question that Glaucon's asking. Do we perform good actions because we want a reward? Or to put it negatively, do we do good things because we fear we're going to be punished? And if that's the case, can you really say that that person is good? You could think about this within the context of religion, because this is the classic question that's raised in religious traditions like Christianity or Islam. Are you doing good because God wants you to do good and because you want to do good? Or are you doing good simply because you fear the punishment or the consequences of that good? Are you obeying God's commands because you fear hell, or because you want to obey God's commands? And this is a similar idea of kind of expressed within the New Testament, that it's not the letter of the law that matters, but it's the heart or the spirit of the law. And Confucius will actually have a similar idea, that what matters the most is not maintaining these traditions, but the heart, the filial piety at the core, at the center of those traditions. And Glaucon is coming down on the negative view of that says that we're only doing good because we fear the consequences of what happens if we don't. And that as a result, none of us are truly good in the Socratic sense, or the Platonic sense, I should say. Glaucon is to top it all off, is making the argument that it's ultimately injustice that serves us best, that it's better actually. Better in terms of financial gain, in terms of gaining popularity, in terms of being loved by people, in terms of being successful, that it's actually better to be unjust. Socrates, of course, will fundamentally disagree and will spend the rest of the entire Republic trying to argue against this. And to argue against this, Socrates is going to go into a very detailed description about the nature and the structure of the human soul and the nature and structure of the perfect city to kind of analyze and explore where justice actually originates from. Now, in order to highlight the Ring of Gyges, though, I want to call attention to other stories that Plato uses to make similar points, one of which is found later on in the Republic, which is known as the allegory of the cave. And the reason why I bring up the allegory of the cave is because you can kind of, and we'll talk about this more later on, and I'll make a separate video on the allegory of the cave, but it's helpful to think of these two stories in conjunction because they represent the opposite of one another. The Ring of Gyges is told in the reverse of the allegory of the cave, and they're supposed to represent two kind of distinct paths that the person in the cave goes through and that Gyges goes through. So let me explain what I mean by that, because Plato is using this imagery in very unique ways here. So the allegory of the cave, and we'll talk about this more in depth, but simply put, Plato gives us the allegory of the cave to talk about his understanding of human nature. The allegory of the cave basically says, so you have this cave as pictured here, obviously, and you have these people chained up at the bottom of the cave. They're chained to this wall their entire lives, and they can only see these shadows that are cast in front of them, and that the people chained up here will perceive these shadows to be reality. One day, one of these prisoners gets free, and what the prisoner notices is that these are in fact shadows, that they're not the real thing, and that these shadows are being cast by these people that are holding these figurines up in front of this fire. So the prisoner crawls out, he goes beyond the wall, he sees the people holding the objects, casting the shadows, he sees the fire. Eventually he crawls past the fire, up and out of the cave into the real world, where he sees the sun and the world what it actually is, without shadows. He sees the brightness of the day. He's almost blinded by the light because it's so bright. So Gyges goes in the opposite direction of the person escaping from the cave. So Gyges starts off in the open field as a shepherd, so he's already starting out in the real world. And what happens in the Ring of Gyges is the opposite move. So the earthquake happens, the ground opens up, Gyges descends into the earth, into the cave, so to speak. And what does he find there? He finds an object that is going to more deeply root and tie him into what Plato sees as the world of shadows, the ring. The ring ties him and binds him to his own bodily desires and wants, and that it binds him so much to his bodily desires and wants that Gyges becomes more deeply entwined in the world of politics, in the world of love, of lust, of emotions, of rage and anger and murder, that Gyges becomes more and more entrenched in what Plato believes is the illusory world, the world of the shadows. So Gyges, the Ring of Gyges, stands over and against, in this sense, the allegory of the cave, in that those two stories move in opposite directions. And Gyges, as a moral story, is supposed to represent what you should not do, which was become more and more involved in the worldly affairs, more and more seeking after your own passions and desires. And another story that will help illuminate maybe a little bit about what's happening with the Ring of Gyges, if you recall, in the story, Gyges discovers the horse that's in the ground. Now, that horse has a special significance for a few reasons. One might be a literary allusion, of course, to the Iliad and to the Trojan War, if you remember. And by the way, the Iliad and the Odyssey are works that Plato would be deeply familiar with, because the Iliad and the Odyssey kind of served as the basis for Greek education. Oftentimes in Plato's dialogues, you'll see Socrates reciting lines from the Iliad and the Odyssey. It kind of provides the cultural foundation, was used as a fundamental aspect of education in the ancient Greek world. And the Trojan horse, of course, represents a symbol of deception, right? The Greek soldiers, the horse is hollow, and it's presented to the Trojans as a gift. Of course, the soldiers are hiding inside of it, and then they wait until after the Trojans are celebrating their alleged victory, and they crawl out of the horse and slaughter everybody. But the horse is what appears to be a trophy and a sign of victory is actually deceptive. It's deceitful. It's what's going to be their undoing, and they let the horse in. But horses appear elsewhere in Plato's writing, specifically in Plato's Phaedrus, in which Plato utilizes the analogy of the charioteer, and he uses this to explain how the soul kind of gets trapped, so to speak, in bodily pleasures, in worldly affairs, I should say. So Plato gives the analogy of the charioteer in that you have a chariot being pulled by two different horses. The chariot driver, according to Plato, is the soul. And he uses this as a way to talk about things like reincarnation, and as a way to talk about how we have knowledge of things like the forms. And if you need a refresher about how Plato's theory of the forms functions, you could check out the Greek philosophy video. But Plato has this idea of the soul after death kind of ascending into the realm of the forms, and the chariot, the soul, is being driven by these two different horses. One of the horses is pulling the chariot downwards, back towards the earth, back towards earthly life, back towards earthly pleasures and desires and wants. And the other horse is pulling the soul upwards towards the forms. And this idea of the analogy of the chariot is used to explain how human beings have two seemingly conflicting desires. A silly example, if you've ever had the pleasure, like myself, of having to constantly diet in order to maintain and control your weight. He uses this to explain why, for example, it's so hard to make the right choice, right? Think about it within the context of a diet, why it's so hard not to eat chocolate cake. You want to, maybe I'm speaking from my own personal experience here. You're always desiring that chocolate cake, even though logically, rationally speaking, you really have no need for it. It's not nutritious. It's not helping you in any way. And it's only acting against your overall health and well-being. So why are you wanting to pursue it? Because it tastes so good, right? So we have these conflicting desires. One of the intellect, right? I know I shouldn't be doing this. And the other of the bodily passions, but I really want to do this because it tastes so good. For Plato, and so Plato has this quote, the charioteer of the human soul drives a pair. And secondly, one of the horses is noble and of noble breed. So the one horse that's pulling us constantly upwards towards the forms, towards truth, towards goodness, towards beauty, towards what we know, what's right. But the other, quite the opposite in breed and character, pulling us down towards those earthly, bodily desires, away from what we know, what's right. Therefore, in our case, the driving is necessarily difficult and troublesome. Doing good is hard because of that. So I give those two examples to show that Glaucon is using this to illustrate a larger philosophical point that human nature is inherently corrupted, but Plato is using this story to reference other elements of his writing to further illustrate this in a more literary way by drawing upon imagery of the horse and upon imagery as a ring, as a representation of political power, and what Plato also thinks of these things. I hope that helped as kind of a brief introduction to the Ring of Gyges. I think that understanding the Ring of Gyges will also help us to understand other myths and parables that Plato uses later on in the Republic, such as the allegory of the cave, but we'll come back to that at a later day. Well, thank you for joining me. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the description of this video, and I'll see you all later.